I was 16 years old during the presidential election of 2008, and it was during this time that I developed a passionate hatred of partisan politics. My friends would sit around the lunch table and repeat what they heard their parents say about each candidate. None of us really understood the issues. We just had that rare quality in 16-year-olds who wanted to sound like they knew what they were talking about. They all agreed so easily about who should win that I asked my teacher how many people would vote for the other candidate, because from the way my friends, or their parents, spoke, he seemed like an obvious loser. I was surprised when my teacher told me that a little less than half the country would vote for one candidate and a little more than half for the other. It really got me thinking. Half the country couldn't be completely stupid. There must be something we were missing. So I began to do research, and without understanding enough to really have a personal view, I brought in articles and newspapers that explained the point of the other candidate. Now, when I came to college, I continued to do this. And surprisingly, people found this really annoying, and they began to question my beliefs. The thing is, I didn't know where I stood on nearly anything. But people don't really like this answer. If I wasn't with them, I was against them. It's simple, right? You get red or blue. Well, at 18, I wasn't ready to choose one political party and everything that came with it. And I don't think that we should have to choose. A 2014 Gallup poll found that 42% of American voters identify as independent, but we don't vote this way. Of the 535 members elected to this Congress, there were 301 Republicans, 222 Democrats, and 2 independents. So where is the disconnect here? Well, let's look at the primary election system. Most states in the United States use a closed primary system, which means that you have to be registered with one of the 2 main parties in order to cast your vote. In this way, voters are being made to sacrifice that independence in order to feel heard. Now let's look at the general election. Electoral votes and not the popular vote are what counts when it comes to winning the presidency. 48 states use a winner-take-all system. Let's look at California, for example. California has 55 electoral votes, which is the most of any state. Let's say 2 candidates are running for president in California. One candidate gets 51% of the vote, and one candidate gets 49% of the vote. You would think that those 55 electoral votes would be split proportionately, so 28-27. But that's not how it works. The candidate who gets the majority of the popular vote gets 100% of the electoral votes of that state. The Electoral College was founded in 1787 by the Founding Fathers, at a time when the voting population of the United States looked like this: white men. Since then, we've passed legislation to include white women, and then African American men and women, and immigrants from every corner of the earth into our electorate. Yet still we use this system that was designed at a time when the population of the United States was 100 times smaller. So it's all really complicated, right? Who can vote, what primary they can vote in, how much their vote counts, so to speak. The only thing that doesn't seem complicated is the political parties. You get red or blue. Pick one. Now, political parties are not a new concept. George Washington warned against them in his farewell address in 1787, saying that they would create jealousy and competition that would ultimately divide the nation. And even as Washington said this, the first political parties had already been formed. And throughout history, we have had many different political parties. But when you think of political parties in America, do you think of these changing entities or stagnant partisan groups that you want nothing to do with? Well, a recent Harvard poll asked 18 to 29-year-olds who is to blame for the problems in Washington. And more than half of respondents said not Democrats, not Republicans, not Congress or the president, but all of them. I was recently a panelist on a television show to discuss a public policy issue. And in the pre-show run-through, I was talking to the producer, and I said, I think it's a bit more complicated than these talking points. And she looked at me and said, our audience doesn't want complicated. And that got me thinking, is she right? Do we, the audience, only want the most simplified version of these really complex and meaningful issues? Is that what we need? Does that make it easier for us to choose? I don't think so. In the 2012 presidential election, only 40% of 18 to 29-year-olds voted. That is awful. But that's also average for the past 30 years or so. In the 1960s, voter turnout among the same age group was between 50 and 60%. So what was it about the 1960s? Well, there was the impending war in Vietnam, and young people were invested in whether or not they would be sent to fight overseas. But 1960 is also the year that politics came to television. It was new and exciting, and it captured the attention of the nation. The candidates were cordial, and they spoke more about their own records than that of their opponent. Sounds a little different from today. In the 2012 presidential election cycle, 80% of television advertisements were negative. This means that 80% of the time, you are seeing an advertisement for a candidate on television that instead of talking about that candidate and their policies and what they wanted to do, talked about the record of their opponent. It is not very inspiring, right? I'm not surprised that we don't vote, but we should vote. The candidates that we're putting in office today are making decisions that will affect our lives in the future in ways that we can't yet imagine. So what should we do? There are 3 things that I think we should all try to avoid. And these 3 things are dogma, disenchantment, and defensiveness. Dogma is living with the result of other people's thinking. Think for yourself. Disenchantment, becoming so overwhelmed by the negativity that we forget the inherent possibility in a democratic system of government. And defensiveness, becoming very entrenched in our own beliefs and ideals, so much so that we forget to listen to the ideas of others. Moving forward to 2016 and beyond, in our conversations with our classmates and our friends, and our teachers and our parents, I challenge you to do 2 things. The first is to demand complexity and not settle for the most simplified version. And the last, of course, is to vote. Thank you.